And we are here with U.S. Senator James Lankford back in Oklahoma after a couple weeks, for a couple weeks from a congressional break in Washington. How are you?
Doing well. Glad to be home.
What have you been up to here in Oklahoma?
Traveling around the state, so it's pretty typical. We've got typically 4, 5, or 6 weeks in D.C., then 1 week back home. This is a little different because it's a week before Easter and after Easter back in town. So I've been in Woodward and Weatherford and Watauga, Chickasha, I think. I'm going to run out of towns here. Bartlesville, Collinsville, Skytook, Tulsa a couple of times, multiple meetings in Oklahoma City, down into Duncan. So yes, we've had Norman, lots of different meetings around the state over the last couple of weeks, and just get a chance to connect with folks and see what's going on.
I imagine some are talking about teachers right now, a massive teacher strike at the Capitol on day 5 right now. So your thoughts on that and how you're going to fund, how the state is going to fund rather, some teacher pay issues.
So it's actually been very interesting to me. I expected to get lots of questions about it, but I think people are discerning enough to know that's a state issue versus a federal issue. I've occasionally gotten conversations with folks the last couple of weeks about what does the federal government do. I know, and they would say, I know this is a state issue, but what has the federal government done? And I can talk about the Every Student Succeeds Act that we passed 2 years ago. That was a bipartisan agreement with President Obama to be able to transition a lot of the authority for schools back to parents and local districts and take care of No Child Left Behind and get that out. So I've talked a lot about that. There have been questions about funding streams and how those things work, and glad to be able to field those questions and be able to talk it through. But ultimately, the state leaders have to be able to make decisions on what needs to happen in our state.
And I understand you disagree with some of the issues on the ball and dice bill.
I do, actually. There's a lot of different revenue streams they're looking at, and I understand as they're trying to be able to explore what's the best way to do it. The legislators have a very difficult task to be able to do. They not only have to look at what's happening in education, but they understand if I do certain revenue streams for this, that means next year when I come back and I have to deal with criminal justice, I have to deal with law enforcement, you have to be able to deal with our mental health issues and how we're handling that. There won't be funds for that because it's dedicated to this. So they have a tough job to be able to balance that out because there are a lot of needs. I do have an issue with the ball and dice. I just don't see a reason to be able to say the best thing that we can do for our kids is to get their parents and grandparents to gamble more. And that seems to be the focus now, is to say if only we could get more parents and grandparents to gamble, then our kids and our schools would be so much better. I think culturally that doesn't help to have parents more disconnected at casinos from their kids. I think that doesn't help us as far as income as a state to be able to continue to have more parents and grandparents spending money at casinos than it does. And that's really what this is. This is casino revenue changing, and so having to add new games to try to encourage people to go back and gamble more. And we're in the weird place as a state. Now we're not just allowing gambling, now we're in the business of a state of promoting gambling and saying we need people to continue to go gamble more. So raising the revenue for the lottery, saying, well, we need bigger prizes because fewer people are playing, so we need more people to go gamble, or we need to add more games to casinos so we can get more people to get back in the casino again. That's a weird place for us to be as a state, just culturally and economically for the state. And I don't see how the two issues are combined, nor should they be combined, and I really don't see it as the best thing for our kids to be able to have their parents and grandparents gambling more and more.
Many Oklahomans also following the controversies around Scott Pruitt. Do you believe Pruitt should resign?
I don't. They're still walking through it. EPA has their own ethics investigation, and the hard part about this is all the facts getting out. What Scott Pruitt did is there's an Oklahoman that lives in D.C., that's worked in D.C. for years, that they've had an ongoing friendship for years back and forth. When Scott was in the earliest days of trying to get up there, they offered him to be able to stay at an apartment. They have an office area that also has an apartment on it. They said, no one's living there. If you want to be able to stay there while you're in town, you can do this, which would seem normal for most Oklahomans to say, if I know somebody in town, I'm trying to get a place, and in the meantime to be able to stay there. Now there's all kinds of challenges about it, and it becomes a big issue. In a normal world, this would seem very normal, but in a political world, everything gets dialed up as far as the volume. Ultimately, the President of the United States determines his staff. He has had times with Secretary Price before where he said he didn't like that he was chartering planes and he pushed him out. I would hope, quite frankly, he doesn't do that with Scott Pruitt, that they allow this to be able to work its course, allow the ethics investigation to be able to go through it and not jump ahead of it. But I think people, if they remove the politics of it and look and see what's really happening, this is one Oklahoman offering another Oklahoman a place to stay until he can find a place. He did that. He found a place. He was out of it a very long time ago, but in that short term, that's what they're challenging.
Have you been able to get a sense of whether Scott Pruitt has the support of the president?
The president's made public statements as recently as today saying that he is in support of Scott Pruitt, and Scott continues to be able to do a good job there.
Speaking of firings, you've said before that the president will not fire Robert Mueller, or you believe he won't fire Robert Mueller. Is that still your position?
Yeah, it's still my position. He's not going to do that. I don't know how many times the White House has to say it. They've said it over and over and over again. They get asked constantly, are you going to fire Robert Mueller? And they keep saying, no, we have no plan to do that. We're not going to do that. Now, it's no grand secret the president's frustrated in the investigation, but they've also been very public from the president's mouth as well as all of his staff around him saying, no, we're not going to do that.
Democrats have suggested legislation that would protect Robert Mueller. What is the harm in that? I mean, as an insurance policy, I mean, we all have insurance that we don't expect to ever use, but we keep it in place. It's a backup.
It's actually a political vote more than anything else, more than an insurance policy. If he's not going to do it, he's not going to do it. And quite frankly, if the president were to fire Robert Mueller, a difficult situation for him becomes 10 times more difficult if you actually fire Robert Mueller, because then it becomes a big issue of what are you trying to hide. One of the statements Trey Gowdy made several weeks ago is one of the clearest statements on this. When you're innocent, act innocent. And if he goes to start firing Robert Mueller, immediately even people that are supportive of him walk away and say, what just happened? Go back to Jim Comey and firing Jim Comey from the FBI. Did that make the situation better or worse? Made it worse, because Jim Comey then pushed to be a special prosecutor, special prosecutors involved, and it's a whole different level. It'd be the same thing with Robert Mueller. He's not going to do it, so I understand the politics of it. It's just not going to happen.
Shifting gears real quick, are we in a trade war right now? Because it feels a little bit, at the very least, a tit for tat right now with China, right?
So let's say we're in a trade provocation at this point. Okay. So yeah, there's a lot of back and forth. The steel tariffs were the first thing to be able to lay out there to say we need to be able to have a worldwide steel, and the president's pulled that back dramatically, exempting Canada, Mexico, South Korea, all of Europe. He's Brazil. He's exempting all these different groups, basically getting to China and Turkey, which have been bad actors in the steel area and dumping steel into the American market. That's a big issue. But in the meantime, there's a back and forth with China right now on trying to be able to raise tariffs on products. Now, none of those tariffs have gone up. They're threats of tariffs. All of them will take several months before any of them would go into place. But we are in a back and forth with them, and quite frankly, there are some issues that need to be resolved with China. China right now, if you want to do business in China, they require you basically turn over your patents and all of your private information and confidential information, because they're going to steal it, and then they're going to go copy it and use it. If we're going to do business in China and continue to do that, we've got to be able to fix that issue.
Speaking of those, the threats from the president and the fact that they are at this point just threats, those of us in the press sometimes have a hard time discerning what the president is when he's announcing a policy and when he's more or less blowing off steam, right, or just thinking out loud a little bit. Do senators have that same problem?
Sure we do. Yeah, we have the same exact issue. His staff has the same thing as well. He's always negotiating and he's always pushing. And it's very difficult to be able to tell what's a push and what's a new policy directive to say this is what it's going to be and I'm not going to change on it. I don't, quite frankly, think he's serious when he put out the statement on Easter saying DACA's over, we're not going to negotiate on this anymore. I think that's a negotiating tactic. I'm going to continue to be able to work on the DACA issue and the things that need to be resolved on immigration. We've got to get those things resolved. Been sitting out there for 20 years. So though he said it, I'm continuing to be able to work through the process, and I feel like we'll be able to turn around and work with the White House and to be able to get this resolved eventually.
How does that affect the way you do your job, though? Do you sometimes just have to kind of ignore that or set that aside and, as you say, continue these negotiations on an issue like DACA?
I still have my same responsibility. I'm one of 2 senators for Oklahoma. That's my job. I'm going to continue to do this. I don't work for the president. The president works for all the American people. He's elected separately. My first responsibility is to be able to represent the almost 4 million Oklahomans and to be able to try to do the best job that I can do for them. And so for me, I continue to be able to move. It's very interesting. I served a couple of years with President Obama. He was very isolated from Congress, didn't like to talk to members of Congress of either party, and didn't really like to engage in those issues. President Trump will randomly call me at night at 9:45 on my cell phone and want to get a chance to chat on some issue that he raises. He's constantly engaging in those conversations. They have 2 very different styles of trying to be able to work through things. You just got to be able to still do your job of what you're going to do and people I'm going to work around.
Is that because he saw you on TV? And I ask because Tom Cole likes to point out that if he's on TV, he often will get a call from the president.
I've had that before. I had that on a Sunday morning where I did an early Sunday morning show. taped it very early that morning. I went to church with my family. As I'm leaving out from church with my family, the president called me and said, "Hey, I saw you on the Sunday show this morning. I wanted to just get a chance to chat with you about that." So that's happened. It's also happened on other just policy issues and things that he was thinking about at the time, and thought, I want to ask you about this.
Speaking of the president's statements, he seems to be indicating that he will want to put National Guard troops on the southern border. Your thoughts on that?
It's not as dramatic of an event as some people make it come out to be. President Obama put National Guard troops on the border for a while. President Bush put National Guard troops on the border for a while. It's not that dramatic. They're not actually law enforcement individuals. They're usually there for humanitarian support or logistical support. Right. We've had Oklahoma National Guard that have been down on the border working in helicopters before, where they are actually providing overhead for our border patrol to be able to give them eyes in the sky, basically. So it's a reasonable thing to do. You don't want to have it all the time, but when there are moments of surge, it's an appropriate thing to do. And if they advance those individuals trying to be able to fight off a summer surge, that does often happen with immigration, is that you'll have a large group of individuals that'll surge across the border. That's when we saw that for President Obama with the surge of unaccompanied minors that happened during that time period. If we actually move additional National Guard troops to be able to help in humanitarian efforts and logistical support behind it, does nothing but help our law enforcement there.
The president has indicated that illegal immigration is down in some ways during his presidency. Is that contradictory then to put National Guard troops on the southern border, to say this is an emergency?
So it was down in the earliest days of his administration, and then it started coming back up again. So if you take early 2017 to about probably late fall, the numbers were down very, very, very significantly, and then they've slowly started ticking back up again. They're not at the levels that they were a few years ago, but they're definitely going back up again.
I think it's about every week I see a headline that says James Lankford says the Russians involved themselves in the elections or meddled in the elections, however you want to phrase it. When is this going to stop being news? Because you've been saying it for a year. The intelligence community has been saying it for, what, 14, 15 months since last January. Is this a debate that people are having in Washington, or is it just an accepted fact?
It should be an accepted fact. There's been so much evidence coming out, and there'll still continue to be more and more and more made public to be able to detail this. And the administration now, for 3 times now in the past year, they put sanctions on Russia. And there's another level of sanctions that are coming down right now on Russia and a whole group of oligarchs that were involved in trying to meddle in our elections. Yeah. So the administration is engaging. They did sanctions after Robert Muller put out the information on his previous indictment on the 13 Russians involved in the social media and the oligarch that was involved there and the company that was doing it. The administration immediately put down sanctions on that, and pretty strong. Then there was another level of sanctions put on them based on the Russians' engagement in England and trying to do a nerve attack there in that spot and kicking diplomats out. And then there's another set of sanctions coming down based on the election meddling right now. So again, it seems to be news because so often the president said, "I'm not convinced," early on, and so people are saying, "Are you convinced now?" Yeah. But it's very clear that they are convinced and have been for a very long time based on their own actions. But I'm surprised that people still ask me that question.
How confident are you in election security in this November?
Election security is a lot better now than what it was in 2016 in a couple of ways. One is there's more transparency. The social media companies are being more aggressive to be able to get information out and to be able to deal with foreign actors trying to be able to engage in our elections. That's something a private company is doing, and some greater oversight, I think, is helping them with that, as the American people are pushing back and saying, "Hey, this platform was used by the Russians. Why did you do it? If you knew it was happening, why didn't you stop it?" Yeah. So that's one issue. The Department of Homeland Security has been very aggressive, working with every state, developing classified networks between the state election group and the FBI and Department of Homeland Security, so there's ongoing communication. So when we see a threat, we're able to get to the states faster. That was a big issue in 2016, is all these threats were occurring, but there was no method of communication. DHS at that time had not developed those relationships with election folks, and so it was months before they found out about it. It was way too late. The one big issue that's still out there is election equipment. The only state that has changed their election equipment has been Virginia so far. Other states are lagging behind this. We still have 12 states that cannot audit their own elections. They're totally dependent on a touchscreen voting system. There's no paper backup. There's no way to be able to evaluate it if that particular system was hacked. Now, it's not attached to the internet the day of the election, but when they do their software updates, if they put in false information in there or change the formulas at all in it, there's no way to validate that machine. That's 12 states still. They're not going to get that fixed by this election. We're encouraging to get that fixed by the 2020 election so we don't have a large-scale national presidential election that we can't audit.
I think your position has generally been that Oklahoma is better than average, at least in
on
this
elections.
regard. Is
Oh
that
yes,
still
by
correct?
far better. Not only because the Russians tried to be able to see, they did scan our system back in 2016 time period, and they were not able to penetrate our system electronically. So we not only held up to that test from a foreign actor trying to be able to penetrate us, but our system is, some people look at it and go, it's old school because it's optical scanners and paper ballots. It's actually exceptionally reliable because the optical scanner's been very reliable, and then we have a paper backup to be able to validate that if there's a question about the optical scanner. That's the best way to do it. It's not old school, it's predictable, and it's auditable.
Those were the questions I had. Anything you want to get to that I didn't touch on?
I'll be back in D.C. Back on Monday, and we've got a lot of nominations still to be able to work through the process on, and obviously additional cabinet level folks that we're going to start working through the process on, and working on reforming the budget. We've got to be able to change the way we do budgeting, and there's a group of 8 Republicans, 8 Democrats, which I'm part of, that working on trying to reform the process of budgeting and see if we can't come up with a better solution rather than the omnibuses over and over and over again, which do not help us as a country.
I do hear from some conservatives who are frustrated by the spending, or they feel like Republican control in Washington would result in less spending, deficit reduction, debt reduction.
Right.
What is your response to that? What is your answer to that?
They should be correct. But the problem is, it's not changed.
Yeah.
We've had 18 omnibus votes now in the past 20 years. So whether Harry Reid was leading the Senate or Mitch McConnell was leading the Senate, we've had the same result in trying to be able to work through to be able to get to appropriations. We have a real problem, and we've got to be able to get to changing the structure of how to do it. McConnell's on board with that. Schumer's on board with that, by the way, to be able to change how we do the budgeting system, and we hope to be able to make that shift. But it has been a great frustration to me that though we've done the tax reform and the economy is going up and we have more revenue coming in, we've not been able to partner that with reducing spending. We've got to do both, or we're never going to get on top of deficits.
U.S. Senator James Lankford, thanks for being here.
Glad to be here.